Hello, we're going to cover the bone list for lab number 15. So lab number 15 covers the vertebral column, the sacrum, the vertebra, the sternum, and the rib. So we'll go over all these bones on the list separately. So first of all, let's talk about the curvatures on the spinal column. Now, I brought this home to make the video, so the curvatures aren't actually here because I didn't want to bring a big skeleton home. But the first vertebra are the cervical vertebra. They form the cervical curvature, the thoracic curvature, the lumbar curvature, and the sacral curvature. So there are 7 cervical vertebra. There are 12 thoracic vertebra, and there are 5 lumbar vertebra. Our sacrum is made up of fused vertebra. We articulate the sacrum with the coxal bones. So this is the hip bone on either side. That forms the sacroiliac joint. So this bone that's part of the coxal bone is called the ilium. So that forms the sacroiliac joint. The tailbone down here is called the coccyx. When I came home tonight, I grabbed some vertebra, and I thought I grabbed the atlas, which I did, the axis, which I did. That's the first cervical vertebra, the second cervical vertebra. I thought I grabbed a thoracic vertebra, but I did not. I grabbed the last of the cervical vertebra. I know it's a cervical vertebra right away because it has these little holes in the transverse process. These are called transverse foramina. So I did not grab a thoracic vertebra. I did, however, grab a lumbar vertebra. So the first cervical vertebra is called the atlas. The atlas is the first cervical vertebra here. It articulates with the occipital condyles via these articular facets, which are found right here. The hole, the major hole right here, is where the spinal column passes through. That's called the vertebral foramina, or the vertebral foramen. It's got the transverse processes on either side, and it also has the transverse foramina. So the C1, or the atlas, sits on top of the axis, which is our second cervical vertebra. This would articulate with the occipital condyles on the skull. And this joint would allow you to say no. So it allows you to, that is a pivot joint right there. So on our second cervical vertebra, which is called the axis, we have the dens. These would be the transverse processes. We have the transverse foramina. And we have the spinous process. So this is what C2 looks like. So you have to know the names of both of these. I'm going to use the next cervical vertebra. I'll use this to name the major parts of the vertebra. We've got the spinous process. The spinous process is what forms the ridge that goes down your back. So when you run your fingers down your back, you feel those bumpy, processes. Those are the spinous processes. So when you touch your spine, I put that in quotation marks, right? When you touch your spine, you're actually touching the spinous processes. These are called the transverse processes, and we have a lot of muscles that attach at these areas here. So you're very, very strong, thick back muscles. Okay, so let's go back down to the vertebra. Spinous process, transverse process. There's our transverse foramina. There's the body of our vertebra. There's our vertebral foramen where the spinal cord passes through. We have what's called the lamina. And then these right here are called the pedicle. The pedicle is what the lamina rests on. Together, they form the vertebral arch. In between the bodies of the vertebra are pads of cartilage, pads of fibrocartilage, and these are called the intervertebral discs. When I was going over our C2, which is our axis, if you notice, I think this is the acute bone because it looks like a little guy saying a prayer. He's holding his hands kind of like he's praying, right? And then we have his head right here. So the little head of the little praying dude is called the dens. So that is the process upon which your C1 will rotate. So that helps make up your pivot joint. That allows you to say no. As we go from our cervical vertebra down to our lumbar vertebra, you'll know that the vertebra will get larger as we go. And I apologize, I didn't actually bring a thoracic vertebra home. If I go back to our spinal column here, and I'm looking at the spinous processes, if I count from C1, 1, C2, 3, darn it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7th cervical vertebra is a point of palpation. It's when you palpate down your back, you feel a prominent process or bone. That's called C7. So that is a point of palpation right there. So that's C7. Then we start with our first thoracic vertebra, or T1. As I move down to our sacrum, there's some architecture on our sacrum that you need to know. The first thing that you would need to know would be the posterior sacral foramen. These are the holes that pass through the sacrum. Then we have the sacral hiatus. The sacral hiatus is found right here, and that is the most inferior opening, if I turn it, of your spinal canal right there. Then we have our median sacral crest. That's going to be the fused spinous processes along the middle of the sacrum. So that's called the median sacral crest. Then we have the sacral promontory. So I'll have to turn my sacrum around. The sacral promontory is an important point of palpation that's going to be found right here. It's a little bit of a collar or a ridge of bone that's at the most superior and anterior surface of the sacrum. It's going to articulate with our intervertebral disc here and our last lumbar vertebra. And that's important because if a woman is having a baby and they're palpating for the cervix to see how open the cervix is, they're going to feel for that collar of bone because that's going to tell them they're in the right area where the cervix would be, or the opening of the uterus. Now we have the rib. The rib is made up of the head, the neck. This is the tubercle. This is called the shaft of the rib. So this is going to be the anterior portion of the rib that articulates with the costal cartilage.